Hi everyone, Josh here. Today is a very special day. It is October 15th, 2025, and this marks 10 years that I've been developing aircraft in flight gear. I had been flying in flight gear for maybe a month or so, but I decided to start developing because I was not satisfied with the level of detail in the aircraft. And while my development started out very slowly, I was working on the 727 briefly, but I really didn't know very much about development at the time, so it wasn't really a lot of progress. I then started the MD-80 project and was working on that for a bit before eventually starting the A320 and MD-11 projects, which would become two of the most advanced airliners in flight gear. And I'm very proud of the work that's been done over the years. It definitely took me, I think, a year and a half to 2 years before the work was really anything impressive. Before that, I was still learning a lot about how developing in flight gear works, as the documentation has never been this project's strong suit. But over the years, I've done multiple different aircraft now, contributed to a bunch of different aircraft, and if I do say so myself, I think I've done very good work. And I'm very proud of the work I've done. So, with this 10-year anniversary, I am resurrecting a small project that I was working on as a side project to the MD-80 back in the day, and that is the MD-90. And my MD-90 back in the day was really just an MD-80 with a different visual model. It wasn't very realistic. It didn't really implement any of the changes that the MD-90 has. And while they are pretty much the same airplane, the MD-90 has many upgrades. Obviously, the new engines, which are high bypass, much more efficient, FADEC controlled. It also had a new electrical system, some improvements to pneumatic systems, and a bunch of other small little improvements aboard the aircraft, and I never modeled really any of that. But this new MD-90 has all of that modeled. And another big thing is we have a new visual model. This is actually not the same visual model that my old MD-90 had. This one is, I made this by stretching the fuselage myself and updating the UV map. And then we have the V2500 engines, and these were actually modified by Samir, who you may know as Capt B, who did the A320 visual model. So he modified his IAE engines from the A320 to match the MD-90. So you can see those installed here. We also have the new pylons with their upward slope, as well as, if you look at the wing here, it's kind of hard to see, we have the updated flap fairings. The landing gear is actually slightly bigger on the MD-90, and a bunch of other small changes to make it a proper MD-90 and not just a tweaked MD-80. Now, another big thing about this project that I wanted to point out for now is those of you that know my MD-80 know that I've not yet simulated the MD-88's avionics suite, aka the Honeywell AFMS and the engine display panel, system display panel, electronic overhead annunciator panel, things like that. And I will do that, but the MD-90 in its standard version has a very similar cockpit to that. And so I figured I'd approach those at the same time instead of trying to complicate it by doing one first and then having to do the other later. So when I do the MD-88 with those cockpit instruments is when I'll also do that standard MD-90. So this project actually simulates something I've been interested in a very long time, but haven't been able to do anything with, and that's the MD-90 Enhanced Flight Deck, which was actually the way the MD-90 was originally supposed to be, but due to its similarities to the MD-80, the airlines, especially Delta, wanted the cockpit and instrumentation to be pretty much the same as the MD-88 that they already flew, so that is what McDonnell Douglas ended up doing. However, Saudia still operated the enhanced flight deck version that was resurrected a couple of years later and finished, and it's a very interesting system. So I'll show you a couple pictures on screen now of it, and you'll see it may look at first glance like a 717 flight deck. But it's actually not. It's earlier than the 717, and it is not the same. And in FlightGear here, I've also modeled it. So if we go to the virtual cockpit, you can see we have the EFD panels here. So you can see that we have our 6 LCD screens. These are not CRTs like the MD-11. They are LCDs like the 717 has, but the firmware and that is on these screens is an earlier version, and it did not have several things that the 717's avionics have, and in some cases has closer resemblance to the MD-11. But the MD-90 still has the old DFGS from the MD-80, and I believe, based on some of the documentation I've seen, they were originally going to put the MD-11 style autoflight system into the MD-90, but since obviously Delta wanted that cockpit to match the MD-88, we got the DFGS instead, and so for the EFD version, there's still the DFGS. So one thing to note is that this pedestal is a placeholder. For those of you that don't know, I'm actually in the process of getting a new pedestal model ready for the MD-80. And when I do that, I'm going to modify it to make the MD-90 one. So this is a placeholder, so just ignore this for now. I did a couple of the changes, like the fuel switches and the EFD flap handle, but this is the placeholder. This will be updated. We do also have the AFMS here. These are CRT screens. You can probably tell they look a little different from the LCDs. And this has been simulated, and we have the integrated electronic standby, which is actually the same one that was in the 717. We also have a different overhead panel, and this is very interesting to me. It's completely unique. This overhead panel is not the same as the 717. The 717 used toggle switches like the MD-80 did, but for the MD-90 EFD, it is laid out like the MD-11 one is, with push buttons and a dark cockpit concept. However, it does not have the automatic system controllers of the MD-11, just like the 717 doesn't, and it does not have a lot of the other automatic switching functionality. So most of these switches are not momentary switches like in the MD-11. They're still on-off switches, but just in push-button form instead of a toggle, and that's because the EFD is really just a cockpit modification. The underlying systems are very similar to the standard MD-90 with just a couple changes. Now, I do have to point out that without Hamza and his kind donation of the documentations, I would not be able to simulate this, because obviously I'm not going to simulate something that I don't have documentation for. But because he was able to provide me with documentation for this airplane, I was able to do an authentic job. Now, obviously, it's not done. There's still a lot to do. But so far, we've got it here. So we'll go ahead and power the airplane up. And something interesting about the MD-90 is that the external power switch is actually normally in the on position. You don't turn the switch off. It's entirely handled by the EPCU, which I think is really weird, and I have no idea why, but that's the way it is. So what you'll see is that when we turn on battery, if you wait a second, this aircraft will automatically turn the external power on. And that there's no on light here, because this is the normal switch position that we can turn it off. And that's the abnormal position, but the normal position is to have the switch in the on position. And you can see now we've got all of our cockpit annunciators on the overhead coming up. We do have the transponder, which is the same as the MD-11, so we can type in a new code there if we want. And we also have, for example, here I'll do this, we got a bunch of the lights here and switches working. I'll go and show you what's working so far. And you can see when we come down to the cockpit, we have on the standby, the power-up self-test here is going, and the screens are still dark. You'll see why in a moment. And the FMSs are awake and on the ident page. You can see that we do have a working AFMS. You may be wondering about all this stuff being so complex. And what I can tell you is I've been working on this for over a year in secret as a derivative of the MD-80 project. And so it's already very, very complex and very accurate. But it's not done, so there will be much more to come. And that's also why I'm not releasing this airplane today. I would definitely want to get the new pedestal in before I do that. And there's a couple small things I need to fix before we can get a release out. But I did want to show it on my 10th anniversary here, which is why we had that livery here. Yeah, I know, it's such a boring livery. Probably needs a splash of color, but I was really focusing on the systems. So what's going on with the screens here, you can see they were going through their initialization process. Now this is the Honeywell VIA system. Same thing that was used on the 717, MD-10, and I believe the 737's NG as well. And so it actually takes a couple minutes for the screens to wake up after power is applied to them. So here we are. Everything is alive now, and what you'll notice here is, yes, this nav display needs to be replaced with a custom one, but that will happen after the MD-11 gets its custom one. We do have the PFD, EAD, SD, which are full custom screens. So what we'll also go ahead and do here is I can show some of the pages on the config page. Again, when the new pedestal comes in, there'll be the selector down there, but for now it's just up here. So we have the config page, and again, all these are actually different from the 717, so they're totally unique. Here's the electrical page, engine page we already saw, the hydraulic page. So those are the ones I've done so far. Now, you may notice that if we have a look, the stabilizer bar is green. And this is a really funny anomaly of this airplane. One of many is that in the MD-90, it uses a mechanical takeoff trim calculator. And while the output of that is reported to the call-out system for the takeoff config warning, it actually isn't reported to this logic here for the stabilizer trim. So it just shows it green while in the takeoff phase, the whole band, which is really funny, and I have no idea why they did this, but that's what they did. We will go ahead and skip the screens up a little further. Let's go ahead and get the IRUs in a line. So we'll set those to nav. And then let's see, do I have instant aligning on? I do. Okay, that will save us some time here because I don't want to wait for it. So we'll have to go to position initialization and take our position and enter it into the set iris position here. You'll see it's kind of like a Boeing. This AFMS is pretty much like a Boeing because it was an afterthought to the MD-80. And since I have the system set to instant alignment, it comes up right away, but the align time is simulated. So now you can see we have our screens online. And you'll notice they do look a lot like the MD-11 ones, but they already have quite a few changes that would end up in the 717. And the most interesting thing is that we have this completely different flight mode annunciator, obviously for the DFGS, instead of the newer auto flight system in the MD-11. And we have no bank limit bar shown on the attitude indicator because the DFGS does not report that information to the VIA computer. So it actually has no idea what the bank limit is, so it's just not there. Which, again, more quirks that I find really funky. Okay, the other thing we're going to go ahead and do is, like the 717, you have to have emergency power armed to see the engine information, but it will come up right away, unlike the MD-11. So you can see here, we've got our engine information. We'll head down to the FMSs again. I'll show you a couple more things. We can enter the route. Now, the functionality of this FMS is equal to what the MD-11 has right now. So it does not have a legs page, but that will come. It does have performance pages, and we can do things like enter our route and go through pre-flight. So we're at Lowy now, so we'll enter that, and let's go to Vienna, and let's say our flight number is 411. And we can go to performance initialization, and like the MD-11, you have little shortcuts there. And reserves, we'll do 5. Okay, we're going east, so we need to be odd. Let's do flight level 250, and we'll do a cost index of 50. For the thrust limits, the EFD has the V25/28s. So to do flex takeoff on this, you actually have to set it to 25K mode. Then we can set a flex takeoff. We do flex 60. We see our EPR is calculated. Now, here is something that the normal MD-80 and MD-90 do not have. V-speed calculations. It's automatic on the EFD. So we can put our flap setting of 11 in here. And weirdly, you have to actually go to the next page to enter the temperature. So let's go ahead and just do, let's see what it is, 20C, yeah, that'll do. And wind information is actually optional here. It's not required for the V-speeds to calculate, which is interesting. Get back to the next page, and we can see we now have our V-speeds calculated. Now, unlike the MD-11, the DFGS does not rely on this V-speed entry for its computations. So that's why we don't have any amber indication there or missing pitch bar. But when you confirm these, you'll see it does show up on the PFD there, like the MD-11, but we don't have that automatic bug because the system is antiquated. So what you're supposed to do is set the airspeed bug yourself to V2 plus 10. So V2 was 143, so V2 plus 10 is in the target. And you can see it now says pre-flight complete. And if we go to our climb page, you can see we have our econ information here. Now this is a little more primitive than the MD-11, so the Mach switchover is a hard switchover at 27,000 feet. It doesn't care what the schedule here is, that's just what it will do. Cruise page, descent page. I should point out that on the DFGS, it's kind of like a Boeing where you have to have VNAV on to use FMS speed. Haven't really decided what I'm going to do. So for now, FMS speed is just a suggestion on the PFD. You can't actually couple it to the DFGS quite yet. So you can see there's already a very good amount of sophistication here. I'm going to go ahead and get the airplane started up. Now, one other interesting thing here is that the flight director system, like the MD-80, does not go into takeoff mode automatically. You have to push the buttons to do that. You can see we now have our takeoff guidance there. It's now in takeoff mode. And also remember that you need to arm altitude sometimes. Now it does have auto arm on, but if you see it like that with no altitude arm, you'll need to arm it by pulling that knob. Now another interesting thing that we'll do when we take off here is, you may notice there's no thrust indicator here, like the MD-80 and standard MD-90 have. There's no way to set the climb thrust, so how do you do it? Well, as you probably saw here, thrust limits are controlled through the MCDU. But you don't actually want to do that, because now we're in manual thrust limits. And you can see we have our box here, and you don't want that. You want to be in automatic, so we'll go back to auto here. So what you do is, and I think that, yeah, that deleted our flex, so let's put our flex 60 back in real quick. Of course, that's going to make us reconfirm our V-speeds. Let's just do that on the second one. Okay. What you want to do is when you're above 400 feet, you pull the altitude knob, which, this is so weird, and I love this. It arms climb thrust, and then at the climb thrust altitude, which is calculated by the FMS, it will automatically go to climb thrust. For the rest of the flight, all the thrust limits are automatic. But a very, very weird quirk, but I really think it's very amusing. Another thing you may notice is that thrust limits are displayed individually for each engine, and they can actually be set individually on the MCDU. That's something the MD-11 and 717 do not do. So, interesting little thing that you can see here. And we also have, of course, our rating mode here. But unlike the MD-11 and its Pratt & Whitney engines, it's white for some reason. Don't really understand, but that's the way it is. Another thing we need to do is set our stabilizer trim, so the mechanical thing would have showed what that is. I already know what it is. It's going to be 4.6, so we'll set that there. And the only thing left on our takeoff thing is the brakes. You can see we're green otherwise, so we'll be ready to take off in a moment here. Okay, so we're now ready for takeoff. So we'll release the park and brake. And go ahead and put that on the climb page there. And we're going to increase the power to about 1.1 EPR. And then we'll turn on the auto throttle switch. The takeoff procedure, kind of like the MD-80. You can see we have EPR 60. The airspeed is alive. There is clamp. 80 knots. V1. Rotate. V2. Positive climb. You're up. Go ahead. If we are above 400 feet, press nav and pull the altitude knob to arm climb thrust. You can see nav track has engaged. Following the flight director. There's climb thrust. Because we use such a high flex, there was not really much of a reduction there. We'll go ahead and turn on autopilot 1. And we're flying along here. And let's say we're now about ready to accelerate. Pretty much done the same way as on the MD-80. You'll see when the system transitions into climb mode, we now have our FMS speed suggestion there. So we'll put 250 in these. And I'm sure that I'll figure out exactly what I want to do, but right now I'm not sure since we don't have VNAV implemented yet. Exactly what I want to do with the VNAV or the FMS speed suggestion. Pretty sure transition level was 5,000 feet, but maybe I'm wrong. But we'll hit standard there. On the display control panel, splash retract. So you can see, instrumentation is pretty similar to the MD-11, but the operation, flying, and the auto flight is like the MD-80. So it's an interesting little combo. When we pass through 10,000 feet, the econ speed, you'll see this will change to active econ climb. There. And now we have 293. So we can rotate the pitch wheel to 293. I don't really expect much interest in this plane because it's a very unique aircraft and not many were made. But I did still want to make this, especially for my own use and to help keep alive the history of one of the most unique airliners ever made. Pretty much one of the only planes, I think only Concorde was made in fewer numbers than this, the MD-90 EFD. So very, very cool airplane to me. And the only attempt at seriously simulating the MD-90 in general, let alone the EFD version in a flight sim. No one really has any realistic MD-90s out there. I think the closest thing you have is an updated visual model for Rotate's MD-80. But that's not an MD-90, and it's not even the right length. So you don't have any realistic MD-90s at all, and especially not any EFD MD-90s. So this is pretty cool to me, and maybe somebody will find it interesting. Maybe they won't. Don't know. But regardless, here she is, and that's all I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if anyone is interested in the airplane, I hope that they will enjoy the airplane when it eventually releases. Usually I don't show so much of a flight in a video, but I'm showing it because there really is no information on how to fly this plane out there. So I just wanted to give a little bit of information on some of the quirks that you may not be familiar with. That's about it for now. 10 years of FlightGear.